that we have a completely blank editor, let's talk about the Project Explorer, which is a window inside the editor. And to get to the Project Explorer, we need to have the standard toolbar up. So let's get the standard toolbar up. Before we close it, I want to show you how to put it back. You right click on the toolbar and you click standard. So you need to know what these toolbars are because you want to be familiar with what your screen is showing you. Like if you didn't know that this was a standard toolbar, you might be confused about these buttons. There's nothing to be confused about. This is the standard toolbar, and we're going to talk about a bunch of these icons here. So what we want to talk about first is this Project Explorer icon. It looks like this. I'm hovering over it, and I can get to the Project Explorer by clicking on this icon, or I can click Control R. Either way, I'll just click on it, and here's the Project Explorer. And now you want to notice a couple things. At the very top in the Project Explorer, it says VBA Project, and then inside parentheses it says the name of your workbook. So my workbook is called Book 1. You can see here it's just called Book 1. I didn't save it or anything yet. If I save it as something else, like File, Save As, if I put Book 11 and just click Save, now if I go to the editor, it says Book 11.xlsx, XLSX. And so that is what the Project Explorer initially shows you at the top, is that the name of your workbook is in parentheses, and then beneath that it sort of has a tree hierarchy where you can see there's a folder that says Microsoft Excel Objects, and within that folder there's a bunch of default items here. There's a sheet 1, there's a sheet 2, there's a sheet 3. And what are these things? Well, these are just areas where you can write code, but it's associated with the sheet 1 in the workbook. And we'll talk about this more in a second, but you can see this workbook has 3 sheets, sheet 1, sheet 2, and sheet 3. If I click on another sheet here and insert a worksheet to sheet 4, or do it again, sheet 5, now if I go back to the Project Explorer, now I have 5 sheets. So all this Project Explorer is sort of giving you a very high level view of the objects you have, the VBA objects you have in your Microsoft Excel workbook. So here's my workbook. What kind of objects do I have within it? Well, I have 5 sheets, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They match the number of sheets that exist in my workbook. And then I have this other item here called this workbook. And this is like a default area where you can write code for the whole workbook. These things here are called modules. And we're going to talk about the modules a little bit more right now. So you're going to be writing your code in these modules. You could write your code in here. So if I double click on this, you'll see a new window popped up. And this is the code window where you can actually write code. And we'll get into that in a second. But I just want to show you that if you double click on this, if I put something in here like sub sheet 2 and just click enter, notice if I double click on sheet 1, it went away. That's because that code I wrote is now in this sheet 2 module. I can close this code window over here. Actually, I can close it by clicking that X there, and the code doesn't disappear. If I double click it again, there's the code, right? But if I close it by clicking this X over here, the code goes away. So all these this is like your containers for your code. Think of a module as the container where you're going to write code. And specifically, there's 5 different types of modules. We already saw 2 of them. The first type of module is a worksheet module, and by default you're going to have as many worksheet modules as worksheets you have in your workbook. So like we just saw, if you have 5 sheets, you're going to have 5 worksheet modules. Here's the 5 worksheet modules. The next type of module, number 2, is this workbook module. And by default, you're always going to have this module. And we'll talk about down the road in this video series how you can write code that that accounts for events that happen in the workbook, and we'll write code for that type of stuff in this workbook module. The third type of module that you can have here, you don't see it, right? There's only 2 types of modules, a sheet module and a workbook module when you initially open. But you can insert the other types of modules. So here's the other types of modules. The third type of module is a form module. So if I click that, look what happens. This is a user form. Maybe you're familiar with this, maybe you're not. But this is like an interface that we can write code and have the users interact with this interface. And we do that by writing code associated, by writing code in these user form modules. Another type of module that you can have, if you go to insert up here, is a class a class module. And these are not used very frequently in Visual Basic, VBA, and Excel. Some very advanced programmers will use class modules, but 99% of the stuff you need to get done in a VBA Excel program, you don't need to use these class modules. And then the last type of module is the most important one. It's just what's called a module here. And this is like a generic module. And you're going to be writing your code 99% of the time in these modules. So notice I said there were 5 different types of modules. You could see them in these 4 folders here. In the first folder, there's 2 types of modules. There's these worksheet modules, and then this workbook module. In this second folder, this forms folder, there's a user form module where if I double click it, you can see the user form. We could write code for it. We'll get into that later. The third folder has a generic module where, like I said, we're going to be writing 99% of our code, and this is how you should write your code in these modules. And the fourth folder has the final type of module. It's a class module here. So what's the takeaway from this video? The takeaway from this video is that we need to have a place where we can write our code. This Project Explorer allows us to see the places where we write our code. You could write your code in here and here. If you double click, you could write code in here. You could write code in here if you double click. You could write code over here if you double click. And we'll get into writing the code in a second, but it's important to know where you write the code and the difference between these modules. Why do we write all of our code in these generic modules most of the time? Because when you have a VBA macro, you don't want to put it behind a sheet here because number one, well, the sheet might get deleted. So if I double click this, and you can see there's some code there, right? If I go into the workbook and I delete it, I'll click delete. I'll go back to my project. Now all that code that I wrote, for instance, if it was thousands of lines of code, is gone. So that's one thing. You can very easily delete your code if you delete a sheet. So instead, we write our code in these modules, and you could have many modules. I can insert another module here and another one. I could just keep inserting stuff. Same way you could keep inserting these other type of modules, these form modules here. You could insert all types of modules, and this sort of eliminates the possibility of deleting your code by deleting a sheet. it also makes it easier to organize your VBA code. Because here, if you had a macro that only was associated with one worksheet and it was very long, thousands of lines of code, you wouldn't want to write all thousands of lines of code in here. You're probably going to have different functions and stuff, so you could split it up in these different modules here. So that is the that is the Project Explorer. It shows you where you can write your code, and we'll get into these things later. The main takeaway again is that we're going to use this folder, the modules folder, and we are going to write our code in these modules, these generic modules. We're also going to write code in some forms, and that'll be like 99% of the time in the real world where you're going to write your code. The other percent of the time you might do some stuff for events when the workbook opens or closes, and you'll do that in here. Very rarely will you write code in here in these worksheet modules, and very rarely will you use these class modules down here. So in the next video we'll talk about the properties window and get more into that.